The year was 1661, and in the gilded corridors of Madrid's royal palace, a secret so horrifying was about to unfold that it would shake the very foundations of European power. Queen Mariana of Austria stood trembling in her opulent chambers, her hands pressed against her swollen belly, as the most fateful labor in Spanish history began. What emerged from that blood-soaked birthing room would not be the glorious heir to the world's greatest empire, but something that court physicians would later describe in hushed whispers as barely human. The infant that drew its first tortured breath that November morning carried within its twisted form the accumulated sins of 2 centuries. Every deformed feature, every struggle for survival, every moment of its tragic existence would serve as living proof of what happens when royal ambition collides with the immutable laws of nature. This is the story of how one of history's most powerful dynasties systematically destroyed itself through an obsession with keeping blood pure, ultimately producing a king so damaged that his very existence would topple an empire. But to understand the magnitude of this genetic catastrophe, we must first witness the golden age that preceded it. The Spanish Habsburgs had once been the envy of every European court, their territories spanning continents, their wealth flowing like rivers of silver from the Americas. They were the masters of the world, the chosen of God, the dynasty that had built an empire where the sun never set. Yet beneath this glittering facade, a biological time bomb was ticking, growing more dangerous with each calculated marriage between cousins, each strategic union between uncle and niece. The roots of this disaster stretch back to 1516, when a young man named Charles inherited the Spanish throne and became the most powerful ruler on earth. This first Charles was everything his distant descendant would never be. Tall, intelligent, commanding, he expanded Spanish dominion across 3 continents and established his family as the premier royal house in Europe. Under his rule, conquistadors carved out vast empires in the New World, bringing back treasures that made European monarchs weep with envy. His son Philip continued this tradition of strength and expansion. From his magnificent palace at El Escorial, Philip ruled territories that included much of Italy, the Netherlands, vast portions of the Americas, and even distant island chains in the Pacific. The Spanish Armada, though ultimately defeated, represented the height of naval power. Spanish nobles lived in unprecedented luxury, patronizing artists whose works would define European culture for centuries to come. Yet even in these golden years, the seeds of future horror were being carefully planted. The Habsburgs had begun their practice of marrying within the family to keep their vast territories unified. Under a single bloodline, Philip married his niece, then later wed his own cousin. These unions seemed brilliant at the time, consolidating power and preventing the division of the empire among competing heirs. The wealth flowing from the Americas created an illusion of invincibility that masked the growing genetic corruption festering within the royal bloodline. Each generation saw the family tree become more tangled, more inbred, more dangerous. Uncles married nieces with increasing frequency. Cousins wed cousins in elaborate ceremonies that celebrated what was actually biological suicide. The Habsburgs pursued this policy with an obsessive determination that surpassed all other European dynasties, convinced that their divine right to rule depended on maintaining the purity of their bloodline. By the early 17th century, the first serious cracks began to appear in the Habsburg facade. Philip III showed less interest in governing than his predecessors, preferring hunting and religious devotion to the demanding work of ruling a global empire. His physical appearance revealed more pronounced signs of the family's growing genetic problems. The famous Habsburg jaw, once merely a distinctive family trait, was becoming increasingly prominent and deformed. Court physicians began documenting strange symptoms they could not explain. The king suffered from periods of confusion and inability to focus on affairs of state. His marriage to his cousin Margaret of Austria produced children, but many died in infancy or showed signs of physical and mental impairment that court officials desperately tried to conceal from foreign observers. The pattern of decline accelerated under Philip IV. whose reign marked the point of no return for the Habsburg genetic catastrophe. Born in 1605, this Philip displayed more severe manifestations of hereditary problems than any previous Spanish king. His famous portraits by Diego Velázquez carefully concealed the full extent of his deformities, but court records reveal a man struggling with significant limitations, both physical and mental. The king's decision to marry his own niece, Mariana of Austria, represented the dynasty's most catastrophic genetic choice. The couple were so closely related that their union amounted to biological suicide for any potential offspring. Court genealogists, if they had been honest, could have predicted the disasters that would result from this marriage. But political considerations overrode any concern for genetic health, and the wedding proceeded with all the pomp and ceremony befitting a royal union. The results were immediate and devastating. Multiple pregnancies ended in miscarriage, stillbirth, or the deaths of infants who showed severe deformities. The few children who survived past infancy often displayed obvious signs of genetic damage that horrified even courtiers who had grown accustomed to Habsburg peculiarities. Queen Mariana's repeated failures to produce a healthy heir became one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Spanish court. Philip's own health deteriorated rapidly as he aged, his mental capacity becoming increasingly questionable. Foreign ambassadors reported that the king often seemed confused during meetings and appeared to have difficulty understanding complex political situations. The famous melancholy captured in Velázquez's paintings may have been as much a result of genetic depression as the burdens of leadership. The Spanish Empire during this period began its irreversible decline. Military defeats accumulated as enemies recognized that Spain was led by rulers whose genetic inheritance made effective leadership impossible. The loss of Portugal, defeats in European wars, and economic crisis all reflected the reality that the empire was crumbling from within, weakened by the very policy that was supposed to strengthen it. As Philip's reign continued, the desperation for a healthy male heir reached fever pitch. The birth of Prince Philip Prospero in 1657 initially provided hope, as the child appeared relatively normal at birth. However, his health quickly deteriorated, and he died at the tender age of 4, leaving the succession once again in terrible doubt. The Queen's subsequent pregnancies were watched with growing anxiety by a court that had learned to fear what each new birth might bring. Courtiers whispered that the royal family was cursed, that God had withdrawn his favor from the Habsburg dynasty. These whispers, though dangerous to voice publicly, reflected a growing awareness that something was fundamentally wrong with the bloodline that had once seemed blessed by divine providence. It was into this atmosphere of fear and desperation that Queen Mariana's final pregnancy began in 1660. The Queen, now worn down by multiple failed pregnancies and the death of her young son, experienced complications that court physicians had never encountered before. Her condition seemed to worsen with each passing month, as if her body was rejecting the child she carried within her womb. Contemporary accounts describe this pregnancy as unusually difficult, with symptoms that suggested the developing fetus was somehow wrong, somehow different from her previous children. Court physicians, bound by royal protocol and their own limited medical knowledge, could only watch helplessly as the Queen endured what appeared to be an increasingly dangerous and unnatural pregnancy. As the due date approached, the entire Spanish court held its breath. The future of the dynasty, the fate of the world's greatest empire, hung in the balance. Elaborate religious ceremonies were organized, prayers were offered at every church and cathedral throughout the realm, and the most skilled physicians in Europe were summoned to attend the birth. But all their prayers, all their medical expertise, all their desperate hopes could not change what 2 centuries of genetic catastrophe had made inevitable. The child growing in Queen Mariana's womb carried within its developing form the accumulated damage of generations of inbreeding. Every chromosome told the story of uncles who had married nieces, cousins who had wed cousins, and a royal family that had systematically violated the fundamental laws of genetic diversity. The labour that began on that fateful November morning would produce not a king, but a living monument to dynastic hubris. The screams that echoed through the royal apartments carried with them the death cries of an empire, the final gasps of a bloodline that had chosen political expedience over biological survival. The moment of birth arrived with a violence that seemed to tear reality itself apart. Queen Mariana's agonized cries pierced the stone walls of the palace as her body fought against the monstrous burden it had carried for 9 torturous months. The royal physicians, their faces pale with dread, worked frantically in the flickering candlelight, while courtiers waited in the corridors beyond, their whispered prayers mixing with the queen's screams in a symphony of desperation. When the infant finally emerged into the world, the silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound. The attending physicians stared in horror at what lay before them, their medical training utterly inadequate to process the grotesque reality of what the Habsburg bloodline had produced. The child's head was massively oversized, his jaw so malformed that his mouth hung permanently open, his tongue lolling grotesquely as he struggled to draw breath through airways that seemed barely functional. The famous Habsburg jaw, that distinctive family feature that had once been painted with pride in royal portraits, had become a monstrous deformity that rendered the infant's face barely recognizable as human. His limbs were weak and twisted. His skin held a sickly pallor that spoke of internal corruption, and his eyes stared vacantly into space without the spark of recognition that should have marked a healthy newborn. Queen Mariana's first glimpse of her son sent shockwaves through her already traumatized body. The woman who had endured years of failed pregnancies and dead children now faced the ultimate horror of having produced something that challenged the very definition of humanity. Her screams, which had been those of physical agony, transformed into something deeper and more primal as she confronted the living evidence of her family's genetic sins. Court officials moved with desperate efficiency to contain the catastrophe unfolding in the royal birthing chamber. The infant was quickly wrapped in elaborate swaddling that concealed most of his deformities, while the handful of witnesses were sworn to absolute secrecy under pain of death. The celebration that had been planned for the arrival of Spain's heir was quietly cancelled, replaced by hushed conferences among the most trusted advisors who now faced the impossible task of governing an empire led by a king who could barely survive his first hours of life. The child, who would become known as Charles II, represented the ultimate expression of 2 centuries of genetic catastrophe. Every twisted feature, every struggle for breath, every moment of his tortured existence would serve as a living indictment of the Habsburg marriage policy that had prioritized political convenience over biological reality. The dynasty that had conquered continents and accumulated unimaginable wealth had finally produced the inevitable result of their systematic inbreeding. Word of the prince's condition spread through the palace like wildfire, carried by servants and courtiers who could barely contain their horror at what they had witnessed. Foreign ambassadors, always alert for signs of weakness in the Spanish court, began sending encrypted reports to their home countries, describing rumors of a royal heir so deformed that his very existence threatened the stability of the empire. The immediate challenge facing the Spanish court was how to announce the birth to the world without revealing the full extent of the prince's condition. Elaborate protocols were developed to limit access to the infant, while official portraits were commissioned that bore little resemblance to the grotesque reality of his appearance. The fiction that Spain had produced a healthy heir would be maintained through increasingly desperate measures that transformed the royal court into a theatre of deception. Charles's early months were marked by constant medical crises that kept the palace in a state of perpetual emergency. The infant could not nurse properly due to his severely malformed mouth and jaw, requiring specially designed feeding apparatus that had to be constantly adjusted as his condition worsened. Court physicians, working with medieval medical knowledge and primitive treatments, could only guess at remedies for conditions they had never encountered before. The child's developmental delays became apparent within weeks of his birth, while normal infants began showing signs of awareness and responsiveness to their surroundings. The future king remained largely passive and unresponsive. His oversized eyes would stare without focus at the ornate ceiling of his nursery, showing none of the normal reflexes that physicians expected from healthy babies. The queen's desperate attempts to stimulate her son's development only highlighted his profound limitations. Walking proved to be another insurmountable challenge for the young prince. His weak, malformed limbs could not support his disproportionately large head, and he remained unable to stand without assistance well into what should have been his childhood years. When he finally achieved a form of movement, it was an awkward, stumbling gait that required constant supervision to prevent falls and injuries that his fragile body could not withstand. Perhaps most tragic of all was Charles's complete inability to develop normal speech. His grotesquely enlarged tongue and malformed jaw made communication impossible, and the sounds he produced were often unintelligible, even to those who spent their lives caring for him. Queen Mariana devoted hours each day to attempting to teach her son basic words, but progress was minimal and heartbreaking to witness. The psychological impact on the royal family was devastating beyond measure. Queen Mariana, who had entered motherhood with dreams of producing the heir who would continue Habsburg glory, found herself caring for a child whose condition made normal development utterly impossible. Her private letters from this period, preserved in Spanish archives, reveal a woman struggling with profound grief and guilt over her son's affliction. King Philip, already showing signs of his own genetic deterioration, reacted to his son's condition with a complex mixture of denial and despair that would characterize the court's response for years to come. The aging monarch continued to insist publicly that his heir was developing normally, while privately seeking increasingly desperate medical and spiritual interventions that promised miraculous cures but delivered only false hope. The secrecy surrounding Charles's condition created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that permeated every aspect of court life. Servants and courtiers who had direct contact with the prince were sworn to silence under threat of execution, while elaborate deceptions were developed to maintain the illusion of normal royal development for visiting dignitaries and foreign observers who might exploit any sign of weakness. As news of the Spanish heir's condition leaked beyond the palace walls, European courts began to reassess their relationships with what had once been the continent's dominant power. The French, the English, the Dutch, and the Austrians all began making quiet preparations for a future in which Spain would no longer be capable of defending its vast territories or maintaining its global influence. The child who should have inherited the greatest empire in human history had instead become its unwitting destroyer. Every labored breath he drew marked another step toward the collapse of Spanish power. Every failed attempt at normal development revealed the fatal flaw that would ultimately bring down the dynasty that had ruled half the world. The Habsburg obsession with bloodline purity had finally produced its inevitable result. The royal family that had married cousins to cousins and uncles to nieces in pursuit of political advantage had created a biological catastrophe that would reshape the balance of European power for centuries to come. The queen, who had given birth to what contemporaries could only describe as a monster, had delivered not just a child, but the death warrant of an empire. The death of Philip IV in 1665 thrust the 4-year-old Charles onto the throne of Spain, creating a constitutional nightmare that exposed the full horror of what the Habsburg bloodline had become. The coronation ceremony itself became a grotesque theatrical performance designed to conceal the truth from a world that still believed Spain possessed a functioning monarch. The crown had to be specially modified to fit Charles's abnormally enlarged skull, while teams of attendants positioned themselves strategically around the throne to provide physical support for a child who could barely hold his own head upright. His inability to speak the required oaths meant that others had to voice the sacred words of kingship on his behalf, raising immediate questions about the legitimacy of his reign that Spanish jurists carefully avoided addressing. Foreign ambassadors, who witnessed this macabre spectacle, returned to their home countries with reports so shocking that many were initially dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. The French representative wrote that he had observed what appeared to be a barely living corpse being propped up and manipulated like a grotesque puppet. The English envoy described scenes that haunted his dreams for years afterward, reporting that the new King of Spain seemed more animal than human in his behaviour and appearance. Queen Mariana, now serving as regent for her incapacitated son, faced the impossible task of governing a global empire while maintaining the elaborate fiction that Charles was capable of ruling. Every official document required the king's signature, leading to the development of increasingly desperate mechanisms for guiding his trembling hand to make marks that could somehow pass for royal approval in the eyes of foreign diplomats and domestic officials. The Regency government became an exercise in systematic deception on a scale never before attempted in European politics. Court scribes perfected the art of forging royal proclamations while maintaining plausible deniability about their authorship. Ministers developed elaborate protocols for conducting meetings in which the king appeared to participate, while actually remaining completely oblivious to the discussions taking place around him. Military commanders in the field began making independent decisions as they realized that orders from Madrid bore no relationship to strategic reality. The Spanish Empire, once famous for its centralized control and efficient administration, devolved into a collection of semi-autonomous territories held together only by tradition and the increasingly hollow symbol of royal authority. The economic consequences of this governmental chaos became apparent almost immediately. Trade routes that had enriched Spain for over a century began to break down as colonial administrators lost confidence in the legitimacy of orders emanating from a court led by an obviously incompetent ruler. The silver mines of Peru and Mexico continued to produce wealth, but increasing amounts were siphoned off by local officials who recognized that accountability to Madrid had become meaningless. Spanish military forces, once the terror of European battlefields, suffered a series of humiliating defeats as enemy commanders realized they faced an empire without effective leadership. The War of Devolution against France resulted in significant territorial losses, while rebellions in Sicily and other Spanish territories went largely unchecked by a government that could barely function from day to day. The psychological impact of Charles's condition extended far beyond the immediate circle of court officials who witnessed his daily struggles. Throughout Spain, rumors began to circulate about the king's divine affliction, creating social unrest and challenging the fundamental assumptions about royal authority that had sustained Habsburg rule for generations. Religious leaders found themselves in an impossible position, torn between their duty to support the monarchy and their growing conviction that Charles's condition represented some form of supernatural punishment. The Spanish Inquisition, while officially maintaining its loyalty to the crown, privately investigated claims that the royal family had been cursed for their excessive pride and departure from God's natural order. As Charles entered what should have been his educational years, the full scope of the challenge facing the Spanish monarchy became undeniable. Traditional tutors, brought in to provide the classical education expected of a future ruler, found themselves confronting a child whose intellectual capacity remained that of an infant despite his advancing age. The complex arts of statecraft, diplomacy, and military strategy were completely beyond his comprehension. Court physicians exhausted every treatment known to 17th century medicine in their desperate attempts to improve Charles's condition. Bloodletting, herbal concoctions, and elaborate purging rituals were applied with increasing frequency, but succeeded only in weakening an already fragile constitution. The king's inability to communicate his suffering meant that these medical interventions often appeared to cause him additional distress without any corresponding benefit. The Queen Mother's personal agony during these years was compounded by her responsibility for maintaining royal dignity while watching her son's condition worsen with each passing season. Her private correspondence reveals a woman torn between maternal love and the growing recognition that Charles would never be capable of the most basic royal functions, let alone the complex leadership required to govern a global empire. Foreign intelligence networks began reporting detailed observations about the Spanish court's increasingly desperate attempts to conceal their king's limitations. Diplomatic meetings were carefully choreographed to minimize Charles's participation, while state ceremonies were redesigned to accommodate his physical and mental constraints without making his condition obvious to casual observers. The broader Spanish nobility gradually fragmented into competing factions, as the reality of Charles's incapacity became impossible to ignore. Noble families that had served the crown for generations began positioning themselves for an uncertain future, recognizing that the traditional structures of royal authority were crumbling beneath the weight of genetic catastrophe. By his teenage years, Charles's condition had deteriorated to the point where even the most elaborate deceptions could no longer maintain the illusion of royal competence. His physical deformities became more pronounced with age, while his mental capacity showed no signs of improvement, despite years of intensive educational efforts by the most skilled tutors available in Europe. The question of royal marriage, crucial for continuing the Habsburg line, presented the court with its most challenging dilemma yet. Charles's obvious physical and mental limitations made the prospect of producing an heir seem virtually impossible, but admitting this reality would have meant acknowledging the end of the dynasty that had ruled Spain for nearly 2 centuries. Court physicians conducting private examinations documented anatomical abnormalities that made normal reproduction highly unlikely. But this information was treated as the most sensitive state secret in European politics. The future of the Spanish Empire depended on maintaining hope, however unrealistic, that Charles might somehow father the next generation of Habsburg rulers. The search for a suitable bride became a diplomatic nightmare as European courts struggled to balance political opportunity against the obvious risks of marrying into a bloodline that had produced such a catastrophic heir. Negotiations proceeded with elaborate courtesy, while private communications revealed the horror that potential marriage partners felt when confronted with the reality of Charles's condition. Marie-Louise of Orléans, eventually selected as Charles's first wife, arrived at the Spanish court in 1679, completely unprepared for the reality of her situation. The beautiful French princess, described by contemporaries as vivacious and intelligent, found herself married to a man whose condition shocked even those who had been warned about his limitations. The wedding ceremony itself required elaborate choreography to conceal Charles's inability to participate meaningfully in the sacred rituals of marriage. Court officials guided his movements throughout the service, while his failure to speak the marriage vows clearly raised immediate questions about the validity of the union that Spanish theologians worked desperately to resolve. Marie-Louise's attempts to establish any form of normal marital relationship with Charles proved utterly impossible due to his severe physical and mental constraints. Contemporary accounts suggest that consummation of the marriage was probably impossible, though court physicians continued to maintain the public fiction that the royal couple was actively attempting to produce an heir to continue the Habsburg dynasty. The new queen's increasing desperation and depression became evident to everyone who observed her daily life at court. Her private letters reveal a woman trapped in a marriage that was more psychological torture than royal union, forced to maintain public dignity while confronting the reality that her husband was incapable of the most basic human interactions. The failure to produce a royal heir after several years of marriage created a succession crisis that dominated Spanish politics and European diplomacy. Foreign powers began making preliminary plans for the eventual partition of the Spanish Empire, while domestic factions competed for influence in anticipation of Charles's death without issue. Marie-Louise's mysterious death in 1689 removed any remaining hope that Charles might produce a direct heir through his first marriage. Rumors of poisoning circulated through European courts, though modern historians generally attribute her death to natural causes, exacerbated by the overwhelming stress of her impossible situation. The search for a second wife represented the final desperate attempt to continue the Habsburg bloodline through Charles's clearly inadequate genetics. The selection of Mariana of Neuburg reflected political calculations rather than any realistic expectation that this marriage would succeed where the first had failed so completely. Charles's second wedding in 1690 followed the same pattern of elaborate public ceremony concealing private dysfunction that had characterized his first marriage. By this time, his physical condition had deteriorated even further, requiring additional assistance to participate in even the most basic ceremonial requirements. The new queen's attempts to fulfill her dynastic obligations proved as futile as those of her predecessor. Charles's worsening health made even the pretense of a functioning marriage increasingly difficult to maintain, while court physicians continued their charade of monitoring the royal couple for signs of pregnancy that everyone understood would never materialize. As Charles entered his 30s without producing an heir, the question of Spanish succession became the dominant issue in European diplomacy. The major powers began negotiating partition treaties that would divide the Spanish Empire among themselves, treating the living king as if he had already died and left his territories vacant for redistribution. The man who should have been at the height of his power had become completely irrelevant to decisions about his own kingdom's future. European statesmen discussed the partition of Spanish territories in conferences where Charles's name was mentioned only as an obstacle to be overcome, rather than a ruler whose wishes deserved consideration. The final decade of Charles's reign witnessed the complete collapse of Spanish power and international prestige. Military defeats accumulated as enemy forces recognized that they faced no real resistance from a monarchy that had become a hollow shell, animated only by the desperate efforts of courtiers determined to maintain their positions in an obviously dying system. The king's physical deterioration accelerated dramatically during these final years, with court physicians documenting a horrifying progression of symptoms that included seizures, apparent paralysis, and periods of complete unconsciousness that lasted for days. The Habsburg genetic inheritance that had been accumulating damage for generations finally overwhelmed his body's ability to function. Foreign diplomats who managed to observe Charles during this period reported scenes that shocked even experienced political observers accustomed to the brutalities of 17th century court life. The sight of Europe's nominal most powerful monarch being fed like an infant, while drooling uncontrollably, became a symbol of Spanish weakness that circulated through every European capital. The Spanish court's final attempts to conceal Charles's condition became increasingly desperate and absurd as his symptoms could no longer be hidden, even during brief public appearances. Official portraits from this period required such extensive artistic license that they bore virtually no resemblance to the grotesquely deformed reality of his actual appearance. As Charles lay dying in the autumn of 1700, European powers positioned themselves like vultures around the carcass of what had once been the world's greatest empire. The testament that would determine the fate of Spanish territories was written by courtiers who understood that their incompetent king could neither read nor comprehend the document that bore his forged signature. The death that came on November 1st marked not just the end of one man's tragic existence, but the conclusion of Spanish dominance in European affairs. The empire that had shaped global history for over 2 centuries would now be carved up among foreign powers according to their military strength, rather than any consideration for Spanish wishes or interests. The final irony of this genetic catastrophe was that Charles's testament, naming Philip of Anjou as his successor, delivered the Spanish throne directly to the French Bourbon dynasty that Spanish Habsburgs had fought for generations. The bloodline that had destroyed itself through obsessive inbreeding had also ensured that their empire would pass to their traditional enemies, completing the circle of dynastic self-destruction. The war that followed Charles's death consumed Europe for over a decade as major powers fought to determine the ultimate disposition of Spanish territories. The genetic tragedy of one damaged king became the catalyst for some of the bloodiest warfare in European history, proving that the consequences of royal inbreeding extended far beyond the immediate suffering of its victims. The Spanish territories that had once formed the world's largest empire were ultimately scattered among the great powers of Europe, with France gaining effective control over Spain itself, while Austria received Italian territories and Britain expanded into former Spanish colonial possessions. The dynasty that had conquered continents found its legacy dispersed like dust across the European political landscape. The remnants of what had once been the Spanish Golden Age now lay scattered across European battlefields, like the bones of some magnificent beast brought low by its own corrupted blood. The cultural treasures that generations of Habsburg rulers had accumulated through conquest and patronage found themselves orphaned by the genetic catastrophe that had consumed their creators. Paintings by Velázquez that had once adorned the walls of royal palaces were traded between victorious powers like common currency, their artistic brilliance serving as monuments to a civilization that had committed suicide through willful ignorance of natural law. The Spanish Inquisition, that fearsome institution which had once enforced religious orthodoxy across half the known world, found itself powerless to prevent or explain the dynastic collapse it had failed to recognize. The same organization that had burned heretics and suppressed dissent for centuries discovered that all their theological certainty meant nothing when confronted with the biological reality of genetic destruction. Their elaborate theories about divine punishment and supernatural intervention crumbled before the simple truth that Charles's condition resulted from nothing more mysterious than accumulated chromosomal damage. In the territories that had formed the backbone of Spanish colonial power, the news of their monarch's death triggered decades of political instability and warfare. Colonial administrators who had governed vast populations in the name of a king they had never seen suddenly found themselves without legitimate authority. The silver mines of Peru and Mexico, which had funded European wars for generations, became prizes to be fought over by competing powers rather than sources of Spanish wealth. The indigenous populations of these territories, who had endured centuries of Spanish rule, now faced the uncertainty of new masters whose policies and intentions remained unclear. The elaborate bureaucratic systems that had administered this global empire disintegrated almost overnight, leaving millions of people to navigate a world where the fundamental structures of authority had simply vanished. European courts that had spent decades positioning themselves for the Spanish succession now scrambled to implement plans that had seemed theoretical until Charles's actual death made them urgent reality. The French court of Louis XIV moved with particular efficiency, recognizing that their Bourbon candidate's claim to the Spanish throne represented an unprecedented opportunity to dominate European politics for generations to come. The Austrian Habsburgs, Charles's distant cousins who had maintained their own branch of the family tree through somewhat less catastrophic marriage policies, found themselves in the peculiar position of competing for territories that had once belonged to their relatives. Their own genetic heritage carried similar risks, but generations of slightly more diverse marriages had prevented the complete biological collapse that had destroyed the Spanish line. British naval forces, already emerging as a dominant maritime power, seized Spanish ports and territories with methodical precision. The empire upon which the sun had never set was being dismantled piece by piece, its former glory measured out in treaties and partition agreements that treated centuries of Spanish achievement as mere real estate to be redistributed among the victors. The Dutch Republic, which had fought for independence from Spanish rule for over 80 years, finally achieved the complete destruction of their former oppressors through patience rather than military victory. The genetic catastrophe that had produced Charles II accomplished what decades of warfare had failed to achieve, proving that some enemies destroy themselves more thoroughly than any external force could manage. Portuguese territories that had been absorbed into the Spanish Empire during the Union of Crowns found themselves suddenly independent again, their nobility scrambling to establish legitimate governance after decades of subordination to Madrid. The restoration of Portuguese independence represented one of the few positive outcomes of the Spanish collapse, though it came at the cost of tremendous social and economic disruption. The Holy Roman Empire, that complex patchwork of German territories and Italian city-states, began reasserting claims to lands that had been Spanish for generations. The emperor, who shared Charles's Habsburg name, but not his genetic burden, moved quickly to secure territories that rightfully belonged to the Austrian branch of the family, using genealogical arguments that would have been meaningless if Charles had possessed the capacity to defend his inheritance. In Madrid itself, the royal palace that had witnessed Charles's tortured existence became a monument to dynastic failure. The elaborate throne rooms where ceremonies of state had been performed for centuries now stood empty, their golden decorations tarnishing in the Spanish sunlight, while European diplomats negotiated the future of territories their former occupant had been incapable of governing. The servants and courtiers who had devoted their lives to maintaining the elaborate fiction of Charles's competence found themselves suddenly unemployed, their specialized skills in royal deception no longer needed in a world where the Spanish monarchy had become a subsidiary of French power. Many of these individuals possessed intimate knowledge of the genetic horrors they had helped conceal, but their silence had been purchased with years of complicity in the dynasty's final deception. Queen Mariana of Neuburg, Charles's surviving widow, faced the peculiar challenge of mourning a husband whose death represented as much relief as loss. Her private writings from this period reveal a woman grappling with complex emotions about a marriage that had been more prison sentence than royal union, grateful for her freedom while genuinely saddened by the suffering she had witnessed firsthand. The medical records documenting Charles's condition, carefully preserved despite their horrifying contents, would eventually provide invaluable insights for future generations of physicians studying hereditary disorders. The Habsburg genetic experiment, conducted inadvertently over 2 centuries, had created one of history's most comprehensive case studies in the effects of systematic inbreeding on human biology. Modern genetic analysis of the Habsburg family tree reveals coefficients of inbreeding that exceed those found in laboratory animals, bred specifically for research purposes. Charles II's survival to age 39 represents a biological miracle that defied every principle of genetic health, making his existence a testament to the remarkable resilience of human physiology, even under the most adverse conditions. The legacy of Charles II stands as history's most chilling reminder that power without wisdom inevitably destroys itself. The Spanish Habsburgs had conquered worlds and accumulated unimaginable wealth, only to discover that their greatest enemy lived within their own corrupted bloodline. The queen who gave birth to a monster had delivered the inevitable consequence of centuries spent defying nature's fundamental laws in pursuit of political convenience. Today, as we witness the empty palaces and scattered territories that once formed the world's greatest empire, we confront an eternal truth: that even the mightiest dynasties cannot escape the price of their genetic sins.